Okay, so I don't see any more people joining in our list. Maybe it's because of the time shifts, but hopefully everybody joins in sometime soon. So maybe I'll leave that to Rosie and Reem to handle that, and I will start beginning our session. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Global Week of Action session 7, which is about the topic of an equity and justice perspective on water security and governance by Professor Harris. The Professor Harris is currently a professor in the University of British Columbia, and she's going to talk about a topic that I just introduced. And yeah, and I think for more introduction of herself, I would leave to Professor's side. And if you guys have any question, please send inside using a Zoom chat function so that our admin team could read those questions, and actually during the Q&A session, it could be answered live or it could be answered through a text version. Thank you, everybody. And the floor is yours, Professor Harris.
Okay, I think you'll need to authorize me again to share. Okay. It'll take it just a second to come up. Okay, great. So you're able to see me, but I'm frozen, it looks like. Okay, now it should be working in just a second. So I'll just give a quick introduction as we're waiting for this to unfreeze. Hopefully it will. So I'm Professor Leila Harris. I'm joining you today from near the University of British Columbia, which is also the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here. So I'm going to be talking about a gender and equity perspective on water security and water governance issues. And I'm very happy to take questions at any point. Excuse me. I turned the silent on my phone, but it still rings on the computer, unfortunately. So I'm going to just be talking through a number of case study examples and then also some conceptual issues around equity and gender. And so my hope is, as you're thinking through the work that you're doing around the development goals or other, you can sort of be able to pose questions or think through some of what an equity and justice perspective or gender perspective might bring to those discussions. And as I just heard from Alexander, you'll be speaking specifically about gender and climate change soon following. So hopefully some of these discussions might be helpful as you proceed. So even though I'll be focused on water, I'm hoping some of the issues as well will be of interest more generally. So just looking for one quick moment, many of you I'm sure are much more familiar than I am about the contours of the SDGs. And of course, there's a specific one focused on gender inequality and empowerment for women and girls. So that would be this one, SDG 5. And SDG 6, for instance, focuses on water and sanitation for all. But there are also sub-elements that are focused here on the specific situation of women and girls that might be vulnerable in the face of, for instance, water and sanitation insecurity. So 6.1 talks about equitable access to drinking water and also sanitation. And there's also 6.2 talks about the impact of water and sanitation on women and girls. So why is it that we give specific attention or special attention to the situation around women and girls or the broader issues around gender when we talk about some of the SDGs? And again, as I said, I'll be speaking specifically to water and sanitation, but I'm hoping that even if you're thinking about the climate change dimensions, thinking about sustainable cities or a number of the other issues, you can also apply some of the similar concepts or insights in terms of vulnerable populations or marginalized populations. So again, I'll be speaking to gender, but you can at least ask questions about race, class, caste, and other dimensions of marginality and how they might be similar or different to the examples that I'll be providing. So let's just start with an overview, and then I'm going to dig in and give you specific examples about how gender might be important for water issues or water governance. So this is, again, just quick overview, and I'll be going more in depth. So don't worry that I'll be doing this quickly. So there's a number of things that we could talk about if we're interested in how do gender and water come together. You know, what are the points of connection and why does this matter? So as I've already mentioned very briefly with the example of the SDGs, there's been a policy focus on women and girls in particular. And so we'll discuss a little bit about why that might be so. There's this idea that different people, depending on how they're situated in society or depending on their responsibility or their particular relationship to resource issues, might be differently affected and might have different uses of those resources or knowledges of those resources. So for instance, if women are in charge of care of sick family members or at home sort of domestic cleanliness and hygiene, then you might have a different relationship to water. Or it's been documented that women often have a different focus on quality of water, in particular because of the preparation of food or care of sick family members as an example. We also, as you can imagine, marginality and difference and inequality becomes very important when you talk about inclusive governance. So who gets to participate when we talk about who's making decisions over key resources and who is heard and acknowledged, whose input is listened to in those spaces. So those are big questions around inclusive governance. There's been, from a feminist or decolonial perspective, there's been a lot of critiques about power and knowledge. So again, I'll give you examples of each of these. So this is just a quick overview before we dig in. So here it's been suggested, for instance, that people who are expert in irrigation or other sorts of technological issues around water, there's often hierarchies that displace local knowledges or indigenous knowledges around these issues. And there's also some really interesting questions around the intersection of inequality and difference, including gender, and how that might matter for issues of activism. So in brief, we know that many activists around the world are often racialized women or people from marginalized communities, indigenous communities, and so forth. So why is that, and what can we draw from that in terms of key insights around inequality and water? So I'm going to broaden as well beyond gender to sort of give you a broader context around equity and environmental justice. Again, just to sort of think about the conceptual resources there and what people have said. And then I want to just give you a few quick examples of where some recent work is moving that sort of adds to and deepens some of these dimensions that I highlighted already. So I'll talk a little bit about emotions, a little bit about what it means to have a non-binary perspective of gender, or to think about LGBT issues in relation to water insecurity and governance. And then we'll talk a little bit more about debates coming from indigenous, feminist, or multiple ontologies. So if you don't know what that means, that's okay. We'll get there shortly. So let's just give a couple of examples of policy. So you already know about the SDGs in terms of how they highlight gender and water. From 1992, there's these discussions that were formalized in the Dublin Principles. So this was 4 key principles around how we should manage water. And one of them, again, is focused on women. So the Dublin Principles includes the idea that women should play a central part in the provision, management, and safeguarding of water. So it's interesting because in the Dublin Principles, there's a broad social context of water, including recognitions such as this one. But the 4th principle, if any of you study water, you might know, also says that we should value water. So that seems like a non-controversial statement, but it's become interpreted or implemented in many policies to be a quite narrow economic approach to water. So payment for water and so forth in terms of what does it mean to value water. So some have commented, and I think there's some truth to this, that there's some tensions between the different principles as they're laid out and also how they've been implemented. So you could read them in different ways. There's, again, this broad recognition of the social context of water management in some of the principles, but also ending with this valuing water has been often interpreted very narrowly and in economic terms only. In many of our development institutions, so international financial institutions or others, we also have gender mainstreaming. So here, there's broadly often this idea that every program should be attentive to gender, and that it's not going to be just some projects are gender focused, but every project should have mainstreaming of gender in it. So giving thought to how women, girls, or other marginalized populations, in my view, would be affected by those policies or changes. But this is a little problematic in ways that I hope will become clear as we proceed through the talk, in that often this is just a very narrow focus on women. And gender should be much broader than that, both in terms of thinking about gender relations, issues of masculinity, but also that more intersectional perspective, which I'll get to in terms of attending to race, caste, class, and other dynamics. And the simple idea is, gender is not the paramount idea of inequality. So an upper class or rich woman might be much better off than many people maybe who are lower income or of a different racial or ethnic group, for example. So we'll discuss intersectionality in just a minute. So those were some of the policy dimensions. Again, just a broad overview. So what about, why is it that people suggest that men and women in particular might use or know water differently? What would be the implications of the way that people might be differently situated with respect to water? So there's a lot of different work on this. One key example is that a lot of cross-national data, so multiple country analyses, have suggested it does tend to most often be women and girls who fetch water, for instance. So when one has to go farther for water or carry it long distances, there would be a differential impact on women and girls. At times, it's suggested that, for instance, girls might be kept out of school because of requirements to fetch water. I'm sure you've heard this before. So if you're spending 2 hours a day fetching water, or that labor is critical for the maintenance of the household, you might be pulled from school or not able to go to begin with. And so this again means that when water is less available, when water is more scarce, or poor quality of water could affect different populations in the community differently, or household dynamics around gender relations and gendered labor division. So there's a couple of studies, as I said, that confirm this to be true. It wouldn't uniformly be true, especially I've noted in urban areas. Sometimes you'll have men doing quite a bit of water fetching as well. So it tends to be a little bit more in rural contexts, but again, not strictly uniform, but a broad trend that we've observed. I'm just going to give you 2 more examples to think through how women and men might be differently affected by water scarcity or quality or context changes. So one example, I'll give 3 examples actually quickly: Bangladesh, India, and then a broad study of disaster outcomes. So this is just an image from the arsenic contamination crisis in Bangladesh. So here it's a snapshot from WHO. It shows with the green spots those wells that were considered still to be safe, and the black ones would be those that were considered to be contaminated with arsenic. This is not pulled from the work of Farhana Sultana, but I'm using it just to highlight her work to say that she has shown how this crisis affects different people differently in this community. Obviously, if you're someone who's still nearby a safe well, you'll be differently affected by someone whose well has been closed off. But she's also documented that women undergo considerable stress and worry around this crisis, in part because notions of femininity, or what it means to be a good mother, are linked to this idea of being able to provide basic needs, including drinking water to the household. So she talks with people in these communities, and they've told her about the tremendous stress they face and suffer from knowing that they might be giving their children poisoned water. Or, for instance, if you're a lower caste or lower income woman, having to negotiate with a neighbor who maybe has a safe well or is able to drill more deeply to keep securing access to safe water, often having to engage in complex social negotiations with those neighbors to continue to access water. So begging, senses of indebtedness or other things that might follow from that. So here you can see it's not just women, it's certain women of certain socioeconomic status, but it's also very much linked to what are the norms around femininity and masculinity, and what does it mean to be a good mother, in the stress of not being able to meet those expectations. A brief example from the work of another colleague, Kathleen O'Reilly, and she's done a lot of work on gender and sanitation issues. And so this example is drawn from her work in Rajasthan, where she's been working for a long time. And this would be an area of the country where there's not a lot of improved sanitation. So many people would be practicing open defecation, for instance. So what she tracked and analyzed is an international NGO, I believe in this case it was German, who went in and they recognized, just similar to the Dublin principles, this recognition and focus on women and their situation. They decided, because of the particular situation of women with respect to sanitation, we're going to focus on women as we implement this sanitation program. And we're going to design it in a way that will empower women. So their goal was that they would be talking with women. They would issue these small grants to build new latrines in the women's names. And they would, the women they thought would become a catalyst for change throughout the region. So women would go and talk to other women. They would form social relationships and bonds. They would take on roles of power in this community program, and they would be empowered as a result. So not only providing sanitation, but empowering women at the same time. You see here in their drawings that they used to distribute to people in the community, that these gendered ideas were really featured. So in the bottom here, you can see the two women speaking to each other about the sanitation program, presumably. But what Kathleen documents is, in this particular region, having latrines now in the home meant that some women no longer had any excuse to leave the home. So because of practices around purda and often being constricted or remaining close to the home or the home compound, having to go and practice open defecation was one of the only excuses that some women had to leave the compound. And in fact, it was a very social event where they would go with other women often to go out to the fields to practice open defecation. So some of the women, contrary to the expectations of they would become empowered and they would go village to village to talk to other women, some women found that they were never able to leave the home at all. And even though the grants were given in the women's names to be able to build these in-home latrines, it was documented that often they were nonetheless not involved in key decisions around the practices. So that just shows you again how something like sanitation, something that seems benign, or even that directly focuses on women's empowerment, might not achieve the goals that one hopes for and expects. So as a last example, just to show how shifts in water access or quality can affect men and women differently. This is a large cross-national statistical study that was undertaken by Neumeyer and Plumper. They looked at data from 141 countries. And what they show is when you have natural disasters, women are more likely to die following those last natural disasters. So there's a gender gap in mortality. And that effect is higher in countries that are considered to be less gender equitable. And the effect is also higher when you have larger disaster events. So a Cat 5 hurricane or a high magnitude earthquake, you see this growing gap in terms of gender mortality. So what does that mean? It means that when you have a natural disaster, something that we know sort of impacts everybody, we've documented many ways in the literature that vulnerable communities are most affected. And it makes sense if you are unable to secure, leave the area because you don't have transportation, or you might have a home structure that's less well built than someone who might be higher income. But here, the gender gap is an interesting one because you wouldn't find many reasons why women should be more likely to die compared to men following these disaster events. So what they hypothesize and what the evidence seems to suggest, it's probably mostly not the event per se. So it's not the moment that the water is rising with the flood or the moment of the hurricane. It's probably the post-disaster aid and how that affects or is carried through differently. So men might preferentially get access to food aid following a disaster, for instance. So lots of interest there to try and understand why men and women might be affected differently by those events. So those are some examples from the literature about how men and women or gender might matter. Men and women might be affected differently, or why gender might matter in the face of water changes. So let's look at a couple of examples of participation. So I've already given you the example from Kathleen O'Reilly, which speaks to this issue of participation. And so how women might not be involved in key decisions around water-related issues. There's a couple of other really powerful examples here. The work of Bina Agarwal has shown in forest governance that women, they might attend meetings, but they might not be able to speak up. It might go in contrast to what is expected to be appropriate for a woman to speak up or to voice her opinion in a meeting. So Agarwal's work has been really interesting because she's shown things like there might be a threshold in terms of the number of women at a meeting that allows women to feel comfortable enough to speak up. She also introduces a number of questions that we can think through in terms of what other issues might we want to attend to besides just having people at the meeting to allow them to feel heard, and that, you know, that it would be appropriate for them to voice opinions or that people would take their opinions seriously. So those are often the issues. It's not necessarily about showing up or are the people there, but what can you do to foster this sense of confidence, or also that other people will pay attention to what people are saying. And so again, I think that's a general insight that can apply for many other marginalized communities and not just issues of women and different communities. I'm going to skip over some of this quickly, but I'll just sum it up to say there's a way in which sometimes when we require participation of women or a particular marginalized group at a governance table or at a decision-making or water user group, for instance, we often might retrench marginalization. So we might be adding to the work burden for someone who's already working 2 jobs or has tremendous labor requirements at the home. We might be, again, making them feel less confident and less secure when they're dismissed, for instance, when they voice their opinions. So how can we attend to all those complex dynamics when we think about participation and engagement? So I just wanted to give some context for this as well. So a lot of feminist work as well as decolonial work has highlighted that there's these ways in which certain knowledge is legitimized and other knowledges might be marginalized. So Marguerite Zavertine is someone who's worked a lot on this in the water world. And so, for instance, she's shown how when irrigation engineers, often who are male, go to a community, how they invoke these sort of ideas around masculinity and expertise in a way that sort of makes other community members feel marginalized and like they don't have a voice. And I'll give you another example just to speak to this in just a minute from work of my colleague in South Africa. But there's these broader questions around who is validated as an expert. How does that get re-entrenched in certain practices that we might think about? So this question about activism is one that I think people have known about for a long time. I don't feel like we have a lot of answers in terms of why this is so, even though I think we could take a few stabs at it. But sort of, again, interesting to document and think through why it is that so many of our activists working in water protection are at the front lines of water-related protests are often marginalized communities, women, indigenous communities, and so forth. So in the context of Canada, we have the women water walkers, who are often indigenous women who are working to protect water. And here's a quote from the Nibi water organizers. It says, "Water is a life giver. Because women also give life, they are the keepers of the water." So how these, again, different labor practices or norms and associations with femininity and masculinity might sort of lead to different ideas of responsibility around water. But there's sort of this ironic tension if you think about it as well. I've just given you some examples from the governance, the formal governance realm. And we've also documented that women are often excluded from those spaces, right? And women are often not given full voice in those decision-making entities and institutions around water. But nonetheless, women are often the most active in terms of water protection. So it could be a direct result of the other. If they're excluded from these formal institutions, maybe one of the only avenues available to them would be protests and engagement in other ways. But I think there's still some interesting issues and tensions, especially from a development perspective. What do we recognize as valid participation? So we might be only focused on the water user group, and we might not be considering participation as being inclusive of this sort of participation around activism. So the people who are marching, protesting, or engaging in other types of water-related protection. So intersectionality is something I just wanted to mention. So if you were working on water and gender, or gender and climate change, or any other issue of that type, or if you're studying women and gender studies at the university, this concept of intersectionality will come up, as it should. And this is basically the recognition I just lost my screen. I'm not sure if you're still seeing me. Okay, there we are. This is basically the recognition that we shouldn't only talk about gender in isolation. We shouldn't only talk about men and women. We have to recognize that there's different power dynamics and inequalities that intersect with, as we talked about, race, class, caste. So if you have any experience with these issues, it makes intuitive sense. So how a white woman is affected by a situation in North America would be very different maybe than how a Black or Latina woman would be affected by these issues. So in the context of South Asia, caste dynamics might play a strong role. So it wouldn't make much sense to only talk about gender without be thinking about how women of higher income, lower income, different caste status or other situations might be differently related to these questions. And a key idea is that it's not just compounding, but like gender only makes sense in relation to those intersections. To talk about the situation of women abstracted from those other categories would be a little bit nonsensical. So let me try and give you one or two examples just to show what this looks like. I did a lot of work on gender and irrigation in southeastern Turkey, where these images are taken near the border with Syria. And just to highlight one or two examples, there were ways in which I found irrigation affected men and women differently. So as we discussed already, women were not often included, for instance, in water user groups to make decisions around irrigation. But it was very clear that women who were working, and all families, who were men as well, who were working in animal husbandry, herding of sheep and goats, were really adversely affected by these changes. So that's a situation where gender might be important, but livelihoods and economic status would be a really key consideration. As well, there were a lot of delineations and distinctions between people who are Arabic speakers or Kurdish speakers in terms of how they understood some of the changes that were underway. So different issues articulated through gender and other intersectional differences differently. So livelihoods, income, ideas of ethnicity, Kurdish and Arabic, and other issues were all really paramount to try and understand how different people were affected by the changes, or why and how different people were more vulnerable in the face of these changes. Another example, this is a recent work by Heather O'Leary that I really like, and she's writing from the context of communities in Delhi, I believe. I'm forgetting all of a sudden if it was Delhi, I think it is, in India. And what she is looking at is how access to water actually reinforces class distinctions in these communities. So very simply put, if one does not have water for basic hygiene, access to sufficient water for basic hygiene, it would be very hard to get a job that would allow you to sort of be upwardly mobile and earn more money. So the way in which access to water sort of reinforces these class divides. Similarly, middle or high income households often really focus on hygiene and overuse water to sort of, because it becomes a symbol of class distinctions, that they're a middle class household because their house is very clean in a certain way. So she talks about how water consumption actually fits with different ideas of class in these communities, and also how access to water reinforces these class distinctions. So she talks about, in these cases, water is kind of enables fluidity between these class distinctions, or lack of access to water sort of retrenches these class distinctions, if that makes sense. So here, this idea of conspicuous use of water increases one's social status and power. So it gives you a sense of how class and water consumption are interlinked in a way that fits with intersectionality. If any of you are following the news around water, or the specific news around North America, you might have heard of the situation in Flint. And I just mention it here because this was a primarily African-American community in Michigan. And there was lead in the drinking water, in part because of decisions that were made around resourcing the water for the residents in a way that was very focused on bottom line and saving money. In the end, didn't save money at all, because now we have huge consequences and health problems from thousands of children who are affected by lead poisoning. And this just makes a very basic point, both about governance issues, who made the decision about why and how the water source would be switched. It was not a democratic decision. It was actually made by people not affected in that community, but at higher levels of government where the decision-making authority was actually taken away from Flint. But the race dynamics here are really key. It was African Americans who were mainly affected by the change. And so this is considered a classic environmental injustice example. So again, I'm just trying to make the broad point that I would definitely say that gender is significant and important, but I would always argue also for a broader equity or intersectional perspective that does not lose sight or actually indeed focuses on race and other considerations that are often paramount when we think through these questions. The other thing that happened in Flint that's significant for the comments that I made already, it's an important example of those issues around knowledge. So I highlighted how certain people's knowledge might be validated, ideas of expertise, certain knowledges are discounted often in these governance spaces. And in this case, the residents were saying for several years that they thought there was a problem with the water. They were repeatedly told by the experts and the government officials, no, your water is fine, it's perfectly safe, there's no problem. And so the frustration was growing because they were seeing and documenting health problems in their community, but they weren't heard. And so a key issue in terms of how we could have rectified the situation sooner would be, how do you have spaces of decision-making that include diverse knowledges or knowledges from diverse populations? So in this context, both as it articulates in terms of African-American communities that were maybe not water experts, but they knew about the water they were drinking, but also the sort of moving away from formal ideas of scientific expertise and incorporating lay knowledges or community knowledges. So that's a big challenge, but I would say also of critical importance for an equity perspective. So not sort of just reinforcing the experts, but bringing in community understandings and concerns as central to how we proceed. Just to sort of make clear that it's not only the US and it's not only issues around race in terms of African-American communities, these are also key issues with Indigenous communities and First Nations in Canada. So both in the US and Canada, it's been documented that Indigenous communities often do not have access to safe and secure water. So 1/5 of all First Nations in Canada are on a drinking water advisory at any given time. And 1/3 of communities in the Navajo Nation, as one example, would not have indoor plumbing, just as two key examples to highlight these sorts of inequities. So I've talked about all these issues in the above. I hope that I've given you a little bit of some context and some examples to think through, what do you mean by participation, inclusive governance, or activism, and why it might be important? What does intersectionality or broader environmental justice frame bring, and why might it be important? I'm just going to end with a couple of examples that sort of broaden the discussion. So this is where some of the literature is moving recently, a little bit more the front edge, I think, of some of the work on gender, but also complicating gender. So moving away from a very binary understanding that's only focused on women or male, female, masculinity, femininity. So the first theme I'll just mention is emotions. This is a really interesting field for me, and it's coming out of feminist work largely, not exclusively. But here, people are understanding that these issues are not just important around water access and quality or who gets to participate in governance. They're not just important because it affects our health. This is something that also people have a very emotional relationship to. So it affects our well-being in ways that really extend beyond whether or not we have safe drinking water from a sort of physical perspective. So I gave you the example of Bangladesh. And I said in Farhana's work, it's become clear that women face a lot of stress because they can't meet the expectations and goals around being a good mother. This is a similar theme that's been documented in the work of Amber Wutich, who's worked a lot in Cochabamba. And when she went to this region, she was really struck with how many people talked about anger, stress, and frustration when they talked about water insecurity. So the quotes here say, worry was constant. A mother said, I was fuming for days because the truck driver didn't come to sell us water. So this is all to say that when she arrived to do that work, she was not thinking about emotional distress or anxiety or worry and all of these things, but residents told her over and over, and this is something I've also seen in my work and has been increasingly documented in the literature. So how water governance or water insecurity can affect us in ways that extend beyond our bodily health, but our sense of well-being. But also, I'm really interested in the senses of inclusion. So do we feel part of the community? Do we feel valued? And I hope you can see a direct connection to something like the question of value of knowledge and expertise. So when the residents in Flint were raising concerns about their water and no one listened, it surely affects their emotional well-being, but also their sense of belonging, inclusion, and whether or not they're considered citizens with everyone else. This sort of emotional sentiment is really captured well by this quote. Then this is from my colleague, Jackie Golden's work in South Africa. And here she was working with Black farmers and asking them about whether or not they'd participate in water governance in their communities. And here this farmer says, I say nothing. I have nothing to say, but it's high time that they've asked me to be here so I can learn. No, I am not ashamed, but I will not speak as I cannot. Shame is about being hungry. I know shame. When I'm inside the committee, I will just say yes until I learn, and they will not know how poor or ignorant I am. It's a terrible thing when you can feel hollow inside. Hunger can make you feel this. Not knowing anything can make you feel this. What this farmer is saying is, after years of being excluded on the basis of being a Black farmer or poor farmer, not being invited to be part of water governance decisions, not being treated as an expert, he's actually saying, I don't know anything still. I'm not an expert, but I'm going to come to these meetings and I'm going to learn slowly until they have to listen to me. And I'm just going to nod and say yes, so that I'm not feeling disparaged for my lack of knowledge. But I'm going to be here, and so that I can be at the table and people will have to listen to what I say. So it just documents for me that complex emotional terrain of what it means when we talk about inclusive governance or bringing in marginalized communities to those spaces. And there's a lot of dynamics going on beyond, can we invite them, or can we make the meeting times to accommodate schedules for diverse populations? But sort of recognizing the power dynamics or these feelings of insecurity or stress or worry that might come from not knowing the technical language or the expertise. I'm going to skip quickly just so we can go to the discussion. Another key area that's really interesting, and only some recent work, is on non-binary approaches. So complicating these ideas that are just too focused on masculinity and femininity, bringing in LGBTQ and other issues, two-spirit issues to these discussions. This has been really interesting. Looking at some of these communities, for instance, in the work of Mukherjee in India, looking at non-binary populations and how they're affected by water insecurity. The work of Vignetta and others has looked at indigenous communities in North America and how often they didn't have a very binary approach to gender, and how this has been affected by colonialism in ways that also affect water governance, they argue, in ways that I think are really interesting. The question of ontologies and ethics is where I want to end. So ontologies refers to what the world is. So when we talk about epistemology, we're talking about how we know the world. So issues of knowledge, of expertise. And ontology is actually saying the world potentially is something different, and people have different relationships to that. So maybe there are different worlds and ways of thinking about what water is. So in the world of water, these are complicated discussions, but to put it simply, when we often go to think about water from an engineering or chemical perspective, we would think about it as H2O. But water is often a much more complex dynamic thing for communities. So a lot of indigenous communities think of water as a relative, water as something living, water as something that people have responsibility towards because it lives with us and is part of our community. So this would just be a different understanding of what water is, which is quite different from water as a resource or water as this sort of chemical H2O. So if you think of water as a relative or as living, you would have maybe a different relationship to these issues or different way of thinking about water governance. And I'm bringing it up because I think it impinges quite a bit on equity. and especially from an Indigenous perspective, but also for other communities, having an appreciation or allowance for these diverse understandings of water and what water is could open new spaces and possibilities for more equitable water governance. So this is just an example of work focused on Indigenous water security from Canada. And here, just as an example, there's a quote from Anishinaabe scholar Deb McGregor, where she articulates this idea of water as something more than how it's often treated. So she says, water is not a single discrete aspect of the environment. It's part of a greater interconnected whole. When one considers water, we must consider all things to which water is connected and related. So here she continues, one must consider all that water supports and all that supports water. So we shouldn't only be focused on drinking water, for instance. When we're focused on SDG 6, we have to think about interdependence of all things. How do we think about the plants that the water nourishes, the fish that live in the water, the medicines that grow around the water, and the animals that drink the water? So I can't speak to intersectional or equity concerns about water without at least mentioning that there's epistemological dimensions around expertise and knowledge, but there's also these ontological dimensions. We often have different understandings about what water is and how it's important. So from other ontological perspectives, we might have this more interconnected approach, which would have deep implications for different ethics around water or different governance of water. So I'll end by just mentioning that I've written a little bit about this last issue around how do we understand ourselves as more connected with and through water. This is informed in part by that example that I just gave you in terms of Indigenous ontologies around water, but also a lot of feminist theoretical currents, for instance, the work by Estrida Naminas. And what she argues is very similar to what Deb McGregor just articulated in that example. Estrida Naminas says, we actually have to understand, because our bodies are 70% water and water moves through us, we're intimately connected to all of the water bodies around us and also other people and other species that depend on the water, whether they be trees or other living things. So here, what she says is we should think about water differently in a way that fosters this sense of interconnection. And that, this again, if we have more of this appreciation around a different ontology or ethics around water, we might manage water very differently in a way that could be more ethical. So I will end there, and thanks for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you for an amazing presentation. Everyone, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the Zoom feature chat box, or even just raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask your question.
I will admit I covered a lot of territory, so I'm very happy to clarify anything that might have been said too quickly. Or if you want to start your brainstorming in terms of the gender and climate change, I'd love to hear some initial thoughts that you're having too for the next session. If anyone wants to speak to that, we could chat about that more.
The next session, since it was asked in the chat box, is actually on June 10th. And also, I'm gonna paste in the chat box right now the link to the brochure magazine, where it has like all the guest speakers who have spoken and everything else that's coming up, and you can learn more about them through there. And also, everyone, MUN Impact has something called the 100 Deeds, where there's a list of 100 deeds you can do to help make change in your community, whether it be big or small. And so I'm gonna paste the link to the 100 Deeds right now. 1 second, sorry. And if you'd like to submit your own 100 deeds that aren't on the list, There's the list, there's the link for submission, which I will paste right now. There you go. And I'm sorry, like, for so many links at once. Okay, so we have the question in the chat box, which is, how do we break the wall of what will the society says?
Mhm. So I think you mean, how do we sort of break down these norms and expectations in society around hierarchies and difference? I think that's the big question. So there's not an easy answer. But I have some interesting examples where they've shown progress. So I'll give you one example, which came from the work that we did on participation. So as I said, you can't just invite someone to come who maybe represents, a lower status group or marginalized community or women and say, come to our meeting, we want you to be involved in the decision making. And often because of gender mainstreaming, that might be the approach we take, or we might even have quotas for so many of this group has to be at the meeting and so many of this group. But that quote, which I find so sad and powerful from that Black farmer that says, that this is a terrible feeling for me to go to the meetings and not feel listened to or not feel like I have anything to say. I think we have to take that seriously too. Like, what are we asking of people? And so one of the interesting examples that I saw was working with rural farm workers, and I'm forgetting the context, I believe is Latin America. And so before people went to meetings, they actually role played and practiced with them. And before people confronted their bosses around labor practices on the farm, they actually did role plays. So let's practice saying these things, which are going to be very uncomfortable, especially if you're confronting power dynamics, right? Or saying that you want better labor conditions, for instance. And so they would practice. And then, when it came to be the time when they actually had to broach the topic with their boss or at the meeting, they felt more confident and comfortable because they had been through it a couple times before and saw different possible responses or got feedback. We do a similar thing at UBC, which is built around challenging people around racism or homophobia. So for instance, people might make a joke that's a little homophobic or a little racist, and you often in that moment feel very caught off guard, and you kind of just say, oh, haha, or you don't know what to say because you don't want to be the one that says, that's a racist joke, I don't appreciate that. So again, what's the appropriate response? It's hard to know. But the whole program is built around enabling people to respond so that they don't just feel caught off guard and like they can't say anything. So you practice, you try and use humor, or you maybe try to play with harshly calling someone out to see how it goes. And you kind of decide maybe how you're going to respond. So when it happens, you're ready, because it's more that feeling of like, oh gosh, I can't believe they just said that. And what am I supposed to say in response? Like, he's my boss or he's my teacher. So again, I think this role playing stuff is an interesting, just small example. It's not big societal change, but like how we can feel more comfortable, maybe challenging power dynamics in our community. That's an example, but I'd love to hear from you. Any others that you can think of? That's an interesting discussion, I think.
If anyone has something to share, you can always just raise your hand. We'll call on you, and it will be a casual, fun discussion.
The other thing that happens in the development world, you see it with the SDGs, and it also is in the water policy world, is we sort of assume, I just wanted to mention this because it relates to the last question. We sort of assume, well, if we can provide water to communities, we're going to overcome gender barriers, right? Because as I said, if women have to go 2 hours to collect water, that's a barrier that faces women. It affects their body. It might keep them from school, as I mentioned. So providing water will achieve gender equity. So I want to just mention that because we often assume we're going to push gender equity by providing toilets or latrines or sanitation, or by providing water, or by providing income possibilities for women. And I think there is some evidence for that, but we also have to be very careful how we're making those connections, and can we actually document and understand whether those outcomes are achieved rather than just assuming they are. And you could take the O'Leary example from Delhi that I gave you around class and water consumption. So the obvious implication would be, if we can break down the association with hygiene and water consumption and class status, maybe broader provision of water will help blur those boundaries a little bit and make those distinctions less clear. And I think intuitively we can think, yeah, that might be a good strategy. Of course, we want to make water available for those people who are lower socioeconomic status, but we also shouldn't just simply assume as soon as we provide water, class will disappear. Like, probably not. Hierarchies are very persistent, they're very universal, and they often become reinscribed even with changing conditions. So I think trying to understand, or not simply assuming we can overcome them in a mechanistic way, I think is important. But empowering communities to have voice, to acknowledge diverse types of expertise are all possible steps. But I would always just want to be careful to not just assume as soon as we give X or Y, create a seat at the table, provide water, provide sanitation, we're going to achieve equality, because that's also, I think, not a good assumption, even though I see it very often in the policy domain.
And I feel like what's interesting is that how, for example, gender equality and water sanitation and everything, yes, they're both major issues facing our world today, but in a way you see them as like um so different. Like, one's right, one's left, yet they're interconnected in a way.
Very interconnected. Yeah, I mean, that's what's so interesting. So there is this one, people do argue that if we want to achieve development, we should achieve gender equity first, because gender is so pivotal to all these other goals, whether it's education of children, health of children, like all of those things we know are affected by gender inequities. But again, it's just not an easy relationship. It's a very complicated relationship, but it's always there. So it's a very astute comment, Reem. But how do we think about it, and how do we bring them together? So I know I went quickly, but I hope I gave you a couple tools as you proceed in your work to be able to highlight gender, or think about what are the questions around inequity that I should be asking when I'm doing this policy work or trying to promote development of this type. We only have a minute or two, and if there's no more questions, can someone just tell me maybe just any point of connection you made for yourself, for your own work, or something you're interested in? So if you work in a different context, do you have an example or anything you can share very briefly with us? Something that sounded similar to something else you know about? Can you say, is it the same as what I was mentioning, Purda, the Parda system? Is that what you're referring to, Abhinav? Yeah. Can you say anything else in terms of how you think it affects some of the issues, the other intersectional issues related to the SDGs, for instance? Do you see those dynamics around seclusion or different use of space impinging on some of the other things that you're interested in? I won't highlight just for you, but if anyone wants to speak to that, if not, we can just say bye and go. All right, thanks everyone. I appreciate the invitation, and I hope you wish you luck in your work moving forward.
Thank you for giving us your time today. Such a wonderful session.
Okay, thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. Everyone, the session is over, so like you're good to go.